Hi, everybody. I'll just do a quick sound check. Can I be heard? No? Okay, great. Thank you. My name's Alison Duncan. I head up the economic team at the Australian Embassy in Jakarta. And I'd like to welcome you all to this third day of ANU Indonesia Project's conference on the economic dimensions of COVID-19 in Indonesia. The first 2 days were really interesting. I tuned into yesterday's and I got a readout of the first day. I think it's been a great conference so far. Today's topic is trade, labour and poverty, sharing the pain. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands those of you in Canberra meet today, and pay our respects to their elders past and present and emerging. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are participating today. We've got a great lineup of speakers today. The welcome first up will come from Professor Boediono. As you all know, former Vice President of Indonesia and held many other very important roles in the economic sphere in Indonesia, and is currently Professor of Economics at Gadjah Mada University. After Pak Budi, we've got co-presenters, Pak Arianto Patunru from ANU and Ibu Felippa Amanta, also from ANU, the Centre for Indonesian Policy Studies. They'll be co-presenting on COVID-19, food security and trade, the case of Indonesia. Third, we have Chris Manning, Honorary Associate Professor at the ANU Arndt Corden Department of Economics and former head of the Indonesia Project. Chris will be speaking on the topic, the labour market shock and policy responses to COVID-19. And then finally, but certainly not least, we have Ibu Vivi Alatas, who will be speaking on COVID-19 and poverty. Ibu Vivi, as you all know, is the former lead economist at the World Bank Indonesia Country Office and is CEO of Asakreativita. So once the four presentations have happened, we'll be having a combined Q&A session at the end of those presentations. So if you think of questions that you'd like to ask during the presentation, please use the Q&A function on your screen to ask the questions. There will also be a short voluntary poll toward the end of the Q&A to gauge your impressions of this event. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Bapak Boediono.
Okay. Thank you, Alison. I'm supposed to deliver a welcoming remark. And the wonder of technology has made it possible for me to do that right from my study room in Jakarta. And to ease the burden of Alison, the timekeeper, I will try to discipline myself by reading this short note of mine. Let me first of all welcome all participants to the Indonesia Update 2020, Day 3. The update has been regularly convened for almost 4 decades and has now become a cherished tradition of the Indonesia Project. Here is a forum where scholars, policymakers, practitioners from all fields, students, and anyone interested in Indonesia get together to share and exchange their views in depth and candidly. Rarely do we find a better place for productively engaging in collective learning about Indonesia. Allow me also to say something about the Indonesia Project. When talking about the project, I cannot help reminiscing about my first association with it almost half a century ago, when I was hired as a research assistant there. Yes, a rather humble role. Still, it did not prevent me from benefiting greatly from the chance of interacting with or just listening to the sequence of remarkable groups of scholars, graduate students, and occasionally visiting policymakers that the project had assembled during my years there. Subsequently, my communication with colleagues associated with the project continued during my university years at Gadjah Mada and through all my years in government. I know very well that this experience of mine with the project is not unique. The project is, in my view, a good example of an undertaking that yields enduring long-term benefits. In terms of tangible scholarly works it has helped deliver, but also, no less importantly, the intangible networks of goodwill it has concomitantly created. Let me now turn to our program today. The previous sessions of the seminar provided a broad overview of the economic dimensions of the pandemic faced by the country. Today, we turn our attention to some microeconomic issues: food security and trade, labor, and poverty. They are all important issues in normal times, but become imperative to closely watch in times of crisis. That brings back my memories of what happened during the Asian financial crisis of 1997-1998. I remember toward the end of 1997 and the early months of 1998, as the financial crisis rapidly developed, the country was hit by yet another catastrophe. That is extreme food, especially rice shortages. Severe drought struck not only Indonesia, but also other rice-producing countries in the region, causing region-wide harvest failures. As a consequence, in 1998, the domestic rice price rose by 250%, contributing to a record high overall inflation of 80%. In the last months of 1998 and through the first semester of 1999, there were frantic efforts to secure additional food supplies. I remember around that time, I was sent to Australia to see Prime Minister John Howard, who was then somewhere along his campaign trail, to get assurance of the continued flows of supplies of wheat flour and secondarily meat. The reason is that in Indonesia, wheat flour has a high cross-price elasticity with rice. The labor situation was equally dire. The financial crisis had its full impacts on the real sector in the year of 1998. The GDP was down by over 13%, 1-3. Layoffs in the formal sector were massive. The informal sector swelled. The poverty rate more than doubled, from 11.3% in 1996 to 24.2% in 1998. In the subsequent years, it began to decline, but slowly and haltingly, reaching back to its pre-crisis only 15 years later. Adding to that unpropitious state of affairs, in the late 1997 and early 1998, the political situation had become increasingly explosive. Yes, Indonesia had been caught in a perfect storm. In my view, the simultaneous occurrence of food crisis, widespread layoffs, and sharp rise in poverty in 1998 had played an important role in the progression of events from a financial crisis to an economic crisis and to a social and political crisis that rapidly unfolded in that year. We are now yet again in the midst of another crisis, one that is in a number of ways more delicate and more dilemmatic than the 1998 crisis. There are new unknown unknowns, especially when we look a bit into the future and try to answer such basic questions as how to reorganize your economy, how to reallocate your resources, especially and most delicately your human resources, and how to adjust and reorient your policies in the post-pandemic new reality. There may be some consolations in the short term, though. Fingers crossed, some elements of the 1998 dynamics may not repeat themselves. This time, we might be spared from the drought as severe as in 1997-1998. Also, despite the noises, to my lay eyes, domestic politics look quite benign, far from what we observed and felt in 1998. Nothing is assured, of course. We have just to wait and see. With that closing, I would like to hand over the microphone back to Alison. Please.
Thanks so much, Pak Boediono, and also thank you for making it easy for me with the timekeeping. It was really great to hear those remarks and the comparison with 1998, because I know a lot of people are comparing it, but it's also good to hear your optimistic outlook, although we won't hold you to that because we take your point that nothing is certain. I think that flows on really well to Pak Acho and Ibu Felippa, who are going to talk now about food security. So silakan Pak Acho and Ibu Felippa.
Thank you so much, Alison. Pippa is going to share the screen. Thank you, Pippa. So our paper discusses trade and food security issues in Indonesia in this time of COVID-19 pandemic. I'm grateful to work with Felippa Amanta from the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies in Jakarta. So let me start with a summary of our paper. We recognize the growing concern about the possibility of another food crisis if this pandemic continues. This is different from the previous crisis that were triggered by a supply shock, such as poor harvest and high energy prices. Today, the food supply at the global level is ample. But the problem is the pandemic has disrupted the food supply chain due to many forms of halt in logistics, as well as restrictions in people's mobility. So as food is essential, we argue that the negative impact of COVID-induced restriction on food supply chain should be minimized. Now the food security in Indonesia has not been great to start with, and it might further deteriorate during this pandemic time. And unfortunately, protectionism that has characterized Indonesia's trade policy does not help. On the contrary, we believe that ensuring a free flow of food is crucial. So next, Pippa. Okay, thank you. So this graph shows that the supply of food at the global level is sufficient, at least until today. These are indices comparing production in 2017, 18, and 19 with the average from 2010 to 2019. So we can see that in most cases, the production is higher than that of the 10-year average. Cereal, for example, reportedly is now at the record high production, among which rice is predicted to see a 2% increase from 2019. So next, Pipa. Yes. So it is not surprising that the global food prices have been stable. This graph shows the long run trend of global food price over 3 decades. And we can see that the recent prices have been relatively stable. Next, Pipa. Okay. And of course, then came the pandemic. So immediately we can see some signs of disruption that might affect food supply chain as well. This graph shows significant drops in both container shipping and new export orders at the global level. This is of course of concern because 4/5 of food that people eat globally are actually imported and so subject to supply chain logistics. And disruption to logistics is also evident domestically. So for example, in July, the Minister of Agriculture in Indonesia said that only 6 ships are delivering food to Eastern Indonesia compared to 48 ships per month on average before the pandemic. This has led to food shortages in many provinces in Indonesia. And in addition, we also know that people's mobility needs to be restricted to minimize the infection. So this graph here shows how mobility has been significantly dropped following the first case of COVID-19 in early March. Although recently it seems that the mobility has gradually recovered, perhaps indicating poor management of restriction policy. But even though food is exempted from the large-scale social distancing, PSBB, reduced capacity and local communities building makeshift borders hampered distribution of food. And in addition, mobility can result in a drop in income as households cannot go to workplaces. So without proper assistance, the poorest household may experience worsening food security. So next, Pipa. So, and then we have trade policy. So apparently the pandemic has brought an inverse mercantilist instinct. So countries are rushing to secure domestic supply by stopping exports, but at the same time, in the next slide, they hope that imports are coming in, at least temporarily. So Indonesia also, in the next slides, Indonesia too has been struggling to secure food. For example, eliminating import certification for onions and garlic, suspension of standard for sugar, and relaxation of an SPS clause for wheat flour. And as we argue in the paper, however, these are more like a knee-jerk ad hoc reactions out of panic. The temporary liberalization for onion and garlic, for example, was drawn because their prices skyrocketed. But overall, the general trend of protectionism still remains, including in food sector. So in the next slide. Yes, so our first takeaway message in this paper is that minimizing disruption to food supply chain is very critical. Again, global food supply might be sufficient, but the distribution is not equal and the COVID-induced disruption will just worsen the situation. And in Indonesia, the food distribution is already bad to start with. And as a result, in this pandemic time, food insecurity might further increase. So with that, let me turn over to Pipa.
Thank you very much, Pak Achot. I will continue where Pak Achot left off, which is talking about Indonesia's food security. So as we know, even before the pandemic, Indonesia's food security is already ranked quite low. So this is from the Economist Intelligence Unit's Global Food Security Index, where we're actually ranked 62nd out of 113 countries, way below other neighboring countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and also Vietnam. It's also interesting to note that among the different indicators of food security, we rank particularly low on quality and safety, reflecting our poor dietary diversity. So this, of course, have severe health implications, resulting in anemia and also stunting that affects about 33% of children under 5, which is significantly higher than the global average stunting rate. In addition, the poor food security also meant that even in normal times, 8% of the population, or about more than 22 million people, are undernourished every day. This is a statistics between 2016 and 2018. So we are seeing a worrying trend to begin with, and the pandemic is only exacerbating this food security concern. In contrast to the global food supply, good abundant production, our own production have actually been decreasing in the last couple of years. So we look at the production, and very recently, just in the past 2 years or so, rice production in fact have been going down. We can see this in this drop here, recently in the past 2 years. So this graph is already taking into account the new area sampling frame method of calculating rice. And it's showing that just in the first semester of 2020, rice production is predicted to be around 9.7% lower than the same period as of last year, which is continuing the declining trend from 2018. While supply is still enough to cover domestic demand in the first semester, there are, of course, concerns with rice supply towards the end of the year and early next year, as the dry season only typically contributes about 35% to annual production. And further yet, we also don't know if COVID-19 might further suppress domestic supply. This is because for rice, for example, the rice production is still heavily concentrated in western areas of Indonesia, in Sumatra and Java especially. And interestingly, this map shows that many of the rice producing regions are also showing relatively higher degree of fatality rates due to COVID-19. If the pandemic is to continue, therefore, it is possible that the future production of rice will be further depressed. Now, talking about food prices, the prices of some food items have been volatile. As COVID-19 started to affect economic activities, prices have continued increasing, but also in the last 2 quarters, many food items show a slight drop in price, as we see in chicken and also in sugar. This reflects the downturn in the economy in general as the demand shock kicks in. Farmers are ultimately more disadvantaged and seeing reduced income. But however, if the pandemic is to continue and supply will continue to thin prices, then we worry that prices may go up. But nevertheless, food consumption is still relatively resilient. Compared to other expenditures, of course, the food expenditure did not drop in the last 2 quarters. This confirms that price and income elasticities of food are lower than those of other commodities. In fact, we would still need to buy food as an essential basic need. The second takeaway that we want to get out of this is that we need to strengthen our domestic production. Of course, the declining production is a worrying trend, and that must be addressed. But President Joko Widodo, of course, have acknowledged this problem and also introduced a policy of food estate as a response to this declining production trend. So he mentioned or announced the plan to create a food estate again in Kalimantan. And this harks back to previous policy of his predecessors, such as Pak Suharto's Mega Rice Project and also Pak SBY's Merauke Integrated Food and Energy Estate, which we know from experience failed to deliver the expected harvest that we want out of the food estate, but instead also carry environmental risks and also perverse social risks, such as land displacement for its local communities. So we encourage, instead of food estate, intensification of existing land would be recommended as well. And this can be encouraged through increasing foreign direct investments in agriculture. But unfortunately, FDI in agriculture currently is still restricted per our infamous negative investment list. So foreign direct investment is still quite low, and in general, investment in agriculture is still low. not just the amount of investment matters, but where the investment is allocated also matters. For now, a lot of the investments in agriculture is allocated to traditional conventional methods like irrigation and also infrastructure, pointing to still the conventional ways of our farming and agriculture sector. But instead, research and development still see very low investments in it. We recommend to allocate more investments in research and development program, especially towards more sustainable agriculture, to build a more sustainable and resilient agriculture and increase domestic production. Moving on to the broader food security policy. So Indonesia's restriction on investment is also part of the broader restrictions in food and agriculture sector, which again is also reflecting on Indonesia's broader rising protectionism. The long-held narrative of self-sufficiency in food and agriculture is still very popular, and this is reflected in the arrays of trade restrictions existing on food imports. This is explicitly mandated in Law 18/2012, which explicitly said that food imports are only allowed when domestic supply is insufficient, which it often is. So despite our self-sufficiency narrative, we still import quite a bit of a lot of our staple food, like rice and beef and sugar, soybean, wheat, and garlic. Of course, for some of these commodities, it is just hard for us to grow in Indonesia, for example, like wheat and garlic. But for other commodities that we are so proud of, unfortunately, the self-sufficiency and the protectionist policies are not really complemented with meaningful policies that support the farmers to be more competitive. So as a result, our domestic production are still not able to fulfill our domestic demand. Quite interestingly, in fact, we've been importing rice for a long time. This graph is taken from Pak Acho's forthcoming book chapter on food security, and it's looking at the net import, so import minus exports of rice relative to domestic production. And in the past century, we only export rice in 3 brief occasions here. Other than that, we always import our rice. Despite the fact that we still need to import rice and also other food commodities, Indonesia's non-tariff measures have actually increased in numbers. Just in the past year, non-tariff measures have essentially doubled. Most of this is in sanitary and phytosanitary measures, which is expected as Indonesia's consumers are becoming more aware of food safety and hygiene issues. But also there are technical barriers and quantity control measures that are often in place with no other objective but to limit import. The trade restrictions of course, have implications to our food prices. We see here that rice price, the gap between Indonesia's rice price and international rice price have widened. This is after the food crisis in 2008 and 2009. Indonesia's rice production cost is already more than double more expensive than Vietnam to begin with. And now consumers must pay that premium in the form of higher or more expensive rice prices. And same with beef as well, as we cannot really produce our beef and we must import a lot. But yet with trade restrictions, it have kept beef prices more expensive than international prices. And this is, of course, a worrying trend, especially during COVID-19 pandemic, as people have lost their income and seeing significantly reduced income. So people who in normal times see beef as a luxury item now during COVID-19 pandemic can just never think about purchasing beef at all.
3 minutes, Pippa.
Thank you, Alison. I'll wrap up. So this is the third takeaway for this, is that Indonesia should refrain from closing its borders, as restricting import may push domestic prices up. And this will hurt net consumers, especially the poor who are now struggling to fulfill their daily necessities. And hence, this will be a further blow to food security. But we also see this not only as a food security issue right now during the pandemic, but also with its long-term implications. So the deterioration in economic and also physical access to food will have implications on dietary and nutrition and health. While people in rural areas may adapt to local food sources, such option is difficult for the urban poor. Substitution from more nutritious and fresh food to less nutritious staple food is likely and expected. And this may lead to increased prevalence of anemia and also stunting in children, as is the case in the last Asian financial crisis. But of course, goes beyond food and nutrition and health, because interestingly, this is taken from a research presented in Forum Kajian Pembangunan from Handayani and Utama, looking at households that are experiencing food insecurity are more likely to actually have child labor. This is because as schools are closed and educational services are closed, then parents would just rather have their children work in farms to fulfill their food needs rather than going to school. So now, what do we do moving forward? This pandemic has exposed vulnerability in Indonesia's food system, with declining production trend, inadequate distribution capacity, and limited trade to begin with. But now pandemic has just exacerbated these challenges. Policy reforms and food and agriculture sector are therefore very crucial, and we cannot just go back to business as usual. For that, we think that more investments is necessary to strengthen domestic agriculture production, especially those sustainable investments. Furthermore, diversification of food supply is encouraged, so we don't rely only on domestic production, but also hedging our bets with imports and also international supply as well. And last but not least, we also encourage working with other countries, such as with the current mechanisms in ASEAN +3 emergency rice reserves or the Food Security Reserve Board, and also looking at a promotion of food commodity exchange as a potential solution for this. That's all of our presentation. Thank you very much for the time.
Thanks so much, Pippa and Nacho. That was really interesting, and I think all of my colleagues who are listening in today will be fervently in agreement with the recommendations you've made there. Next up, we've got Chris Manning, who's going to speak to us about the labour market. Please, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alison. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to people, the many people participating in this session. I'm very grateful for the invitation to present, and I'd like to congratulate the organisers of the update for a very innovative and interesting program. My topic is the labour market shock, and policy responses to COVID-19. You study. COVID has put the economy and the labour market into crisis mode, and we've heard the story about that in the previous several sessions. It's clearly very severe social disruptions through job losses, workers stood down, or even withdrawals from the labour force, particularly among females. The big issues are effects by industry and sector, by gender, age, and class. Next one, Dottie. Next screen. Next one. Okay, now we've moved forward. Sorry for that interruption. So what are some of the issues? Or where are the most jobs likely to be lost and how to replace them? We know that tourism and labour-intensive industries and in medium, small and micro enterprises have played a huge role in the labour market adjustment. How to ensure that people and especially youth, get back to more productive jobs in the future? And how long and how deeply will young people be affected? And what about older people and job seekers less able to reskill? And how much is the damage temporary and how much is it permanent? What new strategies will be needed coming out of COVID? Next one, Dodi. The issues have made more difficult because the supply effects from the shock of the pandemic are very different from normal slumps in economic activity. So the social distancing, the lockdowns, the controls of labour mobility directly affect the number of available workers to fill jobs. The restriction of mobility of commuters from towns and villages and the limitations on participation in normally crowded markets and labour-intensive industries affect the demand side, affect output and the economy. Next one, Dodi. So I'm going to break the talk up into 4 sections. A very brief mention of Indonesia's labour market leading up to COVID-19, some estimates of the national labour market effects, a discussion of some policy responses, and a brief discussion of beyond COVID. Next one, Dodi. Next one. So I'm now looking at the labour market on the eve of COVID, and I want to make 3 points. First of all, agriculture and the informal sector still account for 2/3 of all jobs, each of them about 1/3 of the economy, even though formal wage jobs have been growing much faster in the past 10 years. Secondly, the nature of many jobs have changed globally, as you all know, and in many parts of urban Indonesia, with the digital revolution and to a less extent automation. We can expect that to speed up after COVID. But with one qualification, that wages are still very low in Indonesia and that labour-intensive investments in areas like garments and footwear are still likely to be profitable on it, both domestically and internationally. Next one. And thirdly, just to mention on the institutional framework, Indonesia's had quite a regulated labour market and businesses adjusted to that tight labour market regulations by making employment of many workers more rather than less vulnerable. So I suggest there are problems, longer term problems that will continue on post-COVID. That is high rates of non-compliance to the regulations and an increase in contract and outsourced workers. Next one, buddy. Now, turning to the second topic, the national employment effects of COVID. Next one, Dodi. Basically, we're still in the dark about the aggregate effects on employment. We don't have National Labour Force Survey data on employment to cover the period of the lockdowns. The latest survey was in February 2020, and the next one will be in August. And the effects, of course, on employment are still unfolding as the struggle against COVID continues. But I'll give some estimates that other people have made. Yes, Dodi. So unemployment is actually predicted to rise only by about 2 percentage points towards the middle of this year, looking at some data from SMERU and from other predictions, a loss of 3 to 4 million jobs. Now that's a lot, but in comparison to a labour market of employed persons of over 100 million, it's not huge. Some people, of course, have suggested it might get up to much higher numbers towards the end of the year. Nevertheless, the social impact, of course, is much greater than the unemployment rates. In particular, the big drop in hours, days worked, people's jobs put on hold, especially in medium, small and micro enterprises, account for well over half of all non-agricultural jobs. And the second important point is, although the aggregate unemployment rates might not rise very fast, they could rise much faster for young people and for young educated people that have always been the vulnerable people group in the labour market when it comes to employment. Next slide. just want to give you 3 estimates of some of the employment effects, indication of what's happened. The ADB has made some projections of employment across ASEAN, looking at a V-shaped recovery and a U-shaped recovery, what they call a short containment and a long containment. Next one, Padodi. And the data is showed in this figure. Even though the COVID situation is much worse than without COVID, Indonesia does better than more globally exposed countries in Asia. The figure compares the situation in with COVID compared without COVID. And so on the left-hand side, you can see that Cambodia and Vietnam have quite major declines in employment compared without COVID. Indonesia in the middle there, the effects are relatively limited. But the long containment, which almost certainly is happening as we speak in Indonesia, will reduce employment by about 4 to 5%. So that's a substantial decline compared without COVID. Next one, buddy. I wanted to refer to an ILO enterprise study conducted during the lockdown in April 2020. And there were 3 interesting effects. I cite these data because it's mainly concerned with small enterprises with less than 10 workers. First of all, 2 out of 3 enterprises suspended their business operations in April during the lockdown. Job losses were experienced by about 63% of survey enterprises that had laid off workers during the lockdown. But paradoxically, many enterprises were having trouble in recruiting workers. A quarter of enterprises could not secure enough workers for their businesses due to a considerable extent to restrictions on movement. Next one, Dodi. And the third one, just a reference to a World Bank survey that shows these effects were experienced evenly across all expenditure quintiles. It's not just the poor and it's not just wage workers, it's right across the board. And by region, a significant share of the workers were from the outer island provinces, not just in Java, where the COVID cases have been concentrated. Next one, please. Now, secondly, I wanted to look at some of the employment effects from the slowdown in output that we now know has occurred in the second quarter in 2020, to look at the sectors where the employment effects have been largest. The decline in employment has been largest. Now, although most industries experience a slowdown in growth rates, except agriculture actually, but there were huge declines in some, and you'll be aware of this from the discussion on the first day. Transport and hotels and restaurants, the hospitality industries, recorded really dramatic declines in output of 20 to 30% compared with the previous year. Air transport declined by 80%. And so you can think of all the jobs that have been affected by such a huge decline. Not just the pilots, the baggage handlers, the technical staff, the travel agents, and so on. Huge effect. The decline in both these industries, of course, is particularly related to the slump in tourism, with the ban on all movements into Indonesia. And for a period, domestic tourism has also virtually cut out for the period of the lockdown. And these effects are particularly felt in Bali and Yogyakarta. I currently live in Yogyakarta, and many of you will know or be familiar with Jalan Malioboro, the hub of Jogja's tourist and trading activities. And Malioboro was like a Jalan Mati. All the lesehan, all the pedagang kaki lima, well over thousands of workers, they'd all gone home. It closed down almost totally for 2 months. Perhaps of interest is that they've all come back again. They came back very quickly after the 17th of August celebrations. So the informal sector can, some indication of the flexibility of the informal sector. Next one, please. The other two industries that I want to focus on is trade and manufacturing, which recorded smaller but still very significant declines in output of around 6 to 8%. Both are very urban, and trade employs a high proportion of informal workers. We have a look at the next slide. Next slide too. So on the left-hand side, from left to right, I've ranked the industries according to the extent of the decline in output. You can see in transport, hotels and restaurants, and trade and repairs, all of them have a significant proportion of workers that are urban and are informal. And Joanna Octavia told us a month or so ago, the loss of jobs during the lockdown was especially severe for motorcycle taxis, street vendors in the main cities, and informal workers dependent on tourism. The next one, please. Just looking at some of the characteristics of workers in those industries, it suggests that more vulnerable people are likely to be very hard hit. In hospitality and trade, quite a high proportion of all workers are female, and we'd expect those effects to affect females in particular. Not only were they female, but a high proportion were less educated. So there's an issue for less educated workers and for women in the COVID-sensitive industries. Next one, please. So summing up, this discussion is quite speculative. We await the results of the labour force survey for confirmation. I'm taking the data on the distribution of workers from the August 2019 labour force survey. But it does suggest that the effects on both employees and small businesses are likely to be very large, as long as the economy remains depressed, and may even get worse if further lockdowns are put in place. Next one, Dory. Just a couple of qualifications. This is a very urban-oriented set of statistics, and Acho, the two speakers previous to me, emphasised the problems in agriculture that are likely also to impact on employment. But so far, those effects are not very obvious. And just one subgroup that has been particularly hard hit are migrant workers. And many of them have had to come back, including Indonesia's many workers in cruise ships, a lot of them from Bali. So they're one group that'll be particularly affected. Next slide. Now I'm going to turn to policy issues. Next one, Dottie. There's been a wide array, as you all know, a wide array of social assistance programs to support the poor. The bottom three to four deciles, the Family Hope program, the Kartu Sembako, groceries assistance, and cash assistance with the BLT. Those programs, of course, first impact on poverty, and Vivi will talk about that, but they also can be expected to create jobs. And I agree very much with Hadi Basri's comments yesterday that above all, getting money out into the consumers is a very high priority, not only for poverty, but also for jobs. There is this time around and much better prepared some assistance for medium, small and micro enterprises. But we should remember that the bigger problem identified by many speakers in this conference is the slow rollout of spending in all of these programs, and perhaps the large number of programs that makes management quite difficult. Next one. There have been efforts in recent months to support low and middle income, non-poor wage earners that have not benefited from social assistance. Masri and others have identified these groups as being particularly vulnerable. There's the Prakerja card, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second. There's also a new program of wage subsidies of assistance to 14 million low wage, less than 5 million private sector employees to stimulate consumption, and that is being rolled out as I speak. Funds have also been channeled to wage workers through the BPJS Tenaga Kerja, especially for being able to withdraw from their retirement funds. Next one. Now, a few comments on the Kartu Prakerja. As many of you know, and this is quite a controversial program, many of you know, the original idea was unemployment benefits that focused on youth and benefits, training benefits. It was revised with COVID to change with a focus on displaced workers and employees in medium and small and micro enterprises. The size of the scheme was doubled, and there was a greater focus on online courses, which became an issue in the media. Next one. Just a point on some of the problems. The innovative design meant that there was a range of implementation difficulties with COVID, with the Prakerja. Use registrations were interrupted for several months from late May through to August. A target of 80% of beneficiaries and trainees would be selected from laid off or furloughed workers. With greater focus on displaced workers registered with the Ministry of Manpower that had not been included in the earlier scheme. There's now a considerable number of offline courses being provided as well as the online ones. And finally, some prohibition of the partnering platforms from offering courses that are similar to those offered free online, or those that or selling their own courses through their own platforms. So those were some of the changes made. Over about 10 million people have reported to show an interest in the first three waves. Nearly 700 were beneficiaries by July, and now over 3 million are beneficiaries of the Prakerja program. So it is having a significant impact. I know a lot of people are sceptical, but I think that the figures speak for themselves. Workers are laid off workers, and 35% job seekers or employees in medium and small and micro enterprises. Next one. And there's a wide range of courses across different areas. They're not just in food and drink, as some people have focused on in the media, but also in marketing and sales, information technology, and other areas. And a relatively wide geographical spread. Next one, please. So although there's a heavy concentration in Jakarta and Central Java, there are significant numbers, around 5,000, 3,000 to 5,000 and more, right across Sumatra and Kalimantan and Sulawesi, though not in Eastern Indonesia.
Chris, it'd be great if you could start wrapping up. We're almost out of time.
Coming through to it. Next one, please. Beyond COVID-19. Next one, please. So just wrapping up. Now, of course, the demand side of the labour market is quite uncertain. We really don't know what's going to happen. But I think we can safely say, like in 1998, youth unemployment will certainly be higher and the informal sector will be bigger, perhaps much bigger in Indonesia during the recovery, which will take place in 20 to 21, the rest of this year in 20 to 21. Schemes like Kartu Prakerja will be needed to ensure that young people get into the gig economy, into digital jobs. So I think it's a very innovative exercised, even though there's been some major feeding problems with that program. There are high barriers to entry into the labour market and worsening labour market conditions, as Vivi has written about. In a depressed labour market, there's also likely to be tension between the focus of getting more productive jobs in good technology versus regulating basic provisions for workers and emphasising employment. Next one. So and these are very big challenges, and there's no doubt there's be an ongoing labour market challenge running way into 2021, in my view. But Indonesia does have some well-known advantages. I'll finish on a positive note. First of all, as Hal Hill has pointed out, Indonesia is embedded in the East Asian region, which is still the most dynamic region in the world, with a caveat, of course, that dynamic labour markets have depended on economies that are open to trade, investment and tourism. We know there's a history of prudent economic management, and that bodes well for employment. Indonesia's large population size means it's not as vulnerable as many of the other countries like Cambodia or Vietnam to international markets. Jobs are not as vulnerable. And last slide, but Indonesia has a youthful population, as you all know, and its ability, young people's ability to adapt to new technology must be seen as a source of dynamism. And finally, the large informal sector also means opportunities in hard times, so that Indonesia does not have some of the huge social effects that countries like Australia or France or Germany have in adapting to crisis labour market conditions. So thank you very much. Terima kasih.
Thanks so much, Chris, for that really comprehensive and informative presentation, especially with your ending on a positive note there. We're going to move on straight on now to Ibu Vivi Alatas, who's going to talk about poverty. Silakan, Ibu Vivi.
Terima kasih, Bu Alison. Saya akan coba share. Okay. Yeah. The focus of my talk is about improving targeting system in addressing COVID impact. COVID, as Pak Boediono said, is another perfect storm. It is a double melodies, not only health shocks, but also economic shocks. And COVID impact hits almost everyone. With business closed and also mobility restriction, 24% of breadwinners stopped working by early May 2020. This is based on the data gathered by the World Bank. Out of those that continue working, 64% experience reduced income. Households also experienced food shortage. By May, 32% of them stated that they experienced food shortage. It decreased to 26% by June 2020. However, 14% of households experienced worsening food shortage between May and June. And most of them comes from the bottom 40% and from outside Java. So not only the poor, the bottom middle class also need help. And Indonesia has allocated substantial amount of money for COVID social assistance program, as Pak Chris already mentioned, 203.9 trillion for several programs, conditional cash transfer, the in-kind transfer, the social assistance in Jabodetabek and outside Jabodetabek, the Kartu Prakerja that Pak Chris already mentioned, electricity discount, and also unconditional cash transfer. It is important to ensure that this social assistance can help households who need help. For that, targeting is key. Taking into account the uncertainty of when this pandemic will end and the budget needed to help, in an increasingly complex environment of COVID, improving targeting system is needed more than ever. There is a significant reliance on government assistance. 55% of households relied on government assistance. And this reliance is even higher for those households with female, older, lower educated heads, and those in the bottom 40% and in DKI Jakarta. However, the same data showed us that 46% of the households from the bottom 40 do not receive any kind of social assistance program. 51% of households with breadwinner who stopped working also did not have any kind of social assistance program. Similar finding for those who experience reduced income. The good news, this data is like from May 2020, and Ririn Purnamasari, the task team leaders of this data, told me that there is a significant improvement from the third round, but unfortunately, it is not publicly available yet. Nevertheless, we need to improve targeting system. Why? Shock, whatever kind of shocks, financial, fuel, food, virus can happen. Indonesia need ability to address quickly, to help the poor to addressing with whatever kind of shocks. And targeting system is an important instrument in reforming policies so that it can allow government to compensate those who get hurt from when it is reform policy. Targeting system is also an important instrument to ensure better spending so that Indonesia can address its inequality and poverty issues. Even without covariate shocks, poverty is very fluid in Indonesia. People exit and enter poverty. A good targeting system will allow the new poor to enter and the graduates to exit. But improving or establishing targeting system is difficult, especially in a complex targeting environment like Indonesia, the world's largest archipelago, the fourth most populous country, decentralized to more than 500 kabupaten. We also have high vulnerability with multiple targeted programs with different objectives. There is a path dependencies that we need to take into account. We also need to get the buy-in from all stakeholders, not only from central level, line ministers, but also local level, local government, local leader, and of course, from parliamentary buy-in. Buy-in is determined by a number of factors. The credibility of the institution in charge of implementation and targeting is important. And improving targeting cannot be done just by one institution. It needs a collaboration with clarity of role and responsibility. It needs a synergy of an orchestra, not just singing solo. Of course, the performance of the targeting model is another important factor in determining buy-in. Targeting methods needs to be technically correct and the operating procedures are comprehensive and visible. What we need to improve is a system. It is not just about getting new data, but a system that continuously being maintained so that it can be used along the years, that include all the necessary socialization, grievance mechanism, monitoring. In improving targeting, we have to make two decisions: collection methods and selection method. Collection method is like addressing the question which household to assess. And selection method is addressing how to assess those households. Which one should be in the beneficiaries, which one shouldn't be in the beneficiary list. There are several methods, several choices in each of those collection method and selection methods. For collection methods, there are choice of geographical targeting, determine areas to survey, survey sweep, visit and assess all households in certain areas. Community referral, asking community to refer which household needs to be surveyed. Revisit and update pre-existing lists. Or self-assessment, allowing anyone who thinks that they deserve that they can apply. Selection method is in defining, like out of like those being surveyed, which one that you say yes. In rich country, usually we can do mean testing using verified or unverified household income. But in other countries, usually using proxy mean testing. This is a household survey indicators that come up as a scoring system. There are also choices of doing categorical. For example, female-headed household, disabled households, and etc. Or community selection, let the village be the one who select. Or self-selection, anyone who applies enter the program automatically. Generally, a mixed method can be applied in different areas or contexts, and there is no best method for all situations. So in improving targeting system in Indonesia, the two tasks is improving better collection of data on candidates of beneficiary household and improving better selection of beneficiary household from survey data, taking into account that we need more than just the poor, taking into account that the bottom middle income also need helps. In Indonesia, if we want to do an improvement of targeting system, there are 4 steps that needs to be done. In terms of the collection, in very high poverty areas, do survey sweep, assess all households on those pockets of poverty. In other areas, do a combination of dynamic on-demand system and also community can add. And of course, we need to improve the selection method by improving the PMT model that has been used. Let me talk briefly in each of those steps. Survey sweep is important. Survey sweep is collecting data for all households in particular areas. Study indicated restricting survey sweep to the poorest kecamatan can result in significant reduction in exclusion error. We can identify these pockets of poverty by using poverty map that can be constructed using census and Susunas. Of course, the question is, will it be too costly? If we only choose the poorest kecamatan with poverty above certain threshold, the cost per poor household identified can be lower. And the exact number of kecamatan can be adjusted to budget constraint. What about the role of community? There is a plus and minus of community targeting. Community may have local knowledge. Community may know better who got the hardest hit, who experienced recent shocks, may have better information with lower cost of verification. And involving community may also lead to greater satisfaction and buy-in. But there is also a risk of elite capture, KKN, possibility of corruption, nepotism, possibilities that they choose their kinship, or they choose individuals or household for political leverage. Community might also have different objectives than the government objective. They may want to divide equally or may wish to avoid dissent. Actually, there has been quite a lot of studies, research that try to get insights on some of those questions. For example, the questions whether community is better than PMT. One of our research shows that PMT had the lowest rate of mistargeting overall, but community better identified the very poor. You can see from this the PDF functions that you have a better one for those in the bottom tail, that community is better than PMT in terms of addressing the targeting error. So in a nutshell, there is a room for doing a hybrid approach where we do both PMT and community mostly involved in the collection part. In terms of the elite capture questions, there is also another experiment that try to get some insight on these elite capture questions. We did half of villages had community elites only who choose the beneficiaries, and while the other half of the villages of the experiment invited the whole community to a meeting. There is no evidence of elite capture when community is defined as a group of tokoh masyarakat, selected important members of the community, not only just one person, with a proper procedures of how to select the additional households. And the study also showed that there is a higher satisfactions, fewer complaints, facilitator also so less problems when community was involved. So going forward, what should be the role of community if Indonesia would like to address, to improve the targeting system? Community could be involved at the data collection stage. Community can nominate potentially poor household that later needs to be assessed by the selection method. But of course, there is a need of a standardized protocol who should participate to ensure transparency and avoiding nepotism. And of course, in this environment of crisis, we need to select representative of the community to avoid a crowded meeting. What needs to be improved, it is not just about the time being. It is more about ensuring Indonesia have a maintained targeting systems, that whenever Indonesia needs to help and there is emergency for Indonesia to help its own poor, Indonesia can react quickly. For that, on-demand system for continuous improvement is very important. Lessons from other countries indicated that on-demand allocation, on-demand system had a good result. And it can easily increase coverage, much higher coverage. Like, for example, currently we need much higher coverage to help. And it can be done online and offline. Can be conducted offline, but online during COVID, we probably need to maximize online mechanism with some hybrid using community targeting results to ensure better coverage. Of course, socialization is very key here to encourage the poor, the bottom middle class, but discourage the rich. And technology and data can help us to make it available and to verify the claim. There are quite a number of data that can be used to verify their claim. Some of the question, if we open on-demand application, will everyone apply? Actually, with this data that can be verified, we can do self-selection out. If we can combine and link to the electricity utilization, mobile utilization, the level of the BPJS Kesehatan participation, the tax record, and also the dwelling PBB tax, we can self-select the poor from the middle deciles, from the upper decile. And also, if with proper socialization, if everyone knows that there will be verification with other data, we can discourage the rich from applying. And indeed, another experiment shows that if socialization done properly, the rich was discouraged from applying from on-demand system. So how to improve the selection method? How to improve the PMT? The better question is what can be improved? There are 3 things that need to be improved so that we have a better way to select the beneficiaries. There is a problems of missing variable, unobserved characteristic. We need better data that shows transient instead of just chronic characteristic. We need better data that can distinguish upper decile. There is also small sample problem. Indonesia tend to desire to have different model for different kabupaten, and this will create dilemma of specificity versus precision. Having each model for each kabupaten, we have the small sample problem, and we can have the overfitting problem. We need to strike the balance where to do the disaggregation of the model. And of course, there is room for improvement in using the sophisticated machine learning. What I would like to emphasize here, using sophisticated machine learning, deep learning, will not have an optimum impact if all the other problems, such as unobserved characteristic, small sample problem, and the collection methods, like the low coverage from the collection method, we will not have any a good improvement if we only focus on improving the methods only. There is a need to balance to address all of those issues. And there are quite a number of data that can be merged with the SUSENAS data that being used usually to come up with the PMT scoring system. For example, Google Street data to get better data to assess and categorize the neighborhood. Link to facilities using the GPS data to get additional variable such as access to facilities and spatial data. Using the land agency data to improve assessment of neighborhood and have spatial characteristic and land ownership prediction of land value. Using satellite data, illumination at night, it's being used a lot in other countries, vegetation and other data. Dwelling characteristic photo using deep learning MI to get additional verified claim, not just based on the claim of like the household itself, but based on the photo that we gather. Another spatial data. So there are a lot of things that we can use to address some of the problem. If Indonesia do the 4 things that needs to be done. The first one is identifying pockets of poverty, to do the survey sweep, assess everyone, allowing everyone to enter from those kecamatan. The second one, set up a proper on-demand application systems that link to other database to verify claim. The third one, including community with proper SOP and proper procedure and standardized procedure. And the fourth one is addressing the 3 problems of the PMT. Then Indonesia, with political will and with buy-in, Indonesia will have the instrument to address whatever the storm, whenever the storm, Indonesia have the instrument to ensure badai ini bisa cepat berlalu. Terima kasih.
Thanks so much, Ibu Vivi. We've had some great speakers, and I see that we also have some pretty good questions ready to go. So there's, oh, hang on, sorry, my screen's gone a bit funny. I just need to find, okay, so for the first round of questions, we're going to have 3 questions, and then we'll ask the presenters to answer those 3 questions all at once. So in the first round, I'll call on Gwindra Nugraha from the Indonesian Ministry of Finance, and also Hal Hill from ANU. And there's a third question which I'm going to read out, and this is from Riza Priyandita from Bapada Banjarmasin, Banjarbaru. His question is for Pa Arianto and Ibu Felippa. In regards to food security in Indonesia, you recommended, among others, that it is important to cooperate with other countries and ease import restrictions. How do you think this policy will affect small-scale farmers during the pandemic? And what suggestions do you have to minimize the negative impacts that these local farmers might suffer? So that was the first question, and I'll ask Gwindra you can go ahead and ask your question live.
Yep, thank you. I hope you can hear my voice. Thank you for the comprehensive presentation. My questions with regard to Pak Ajo and Felippa's presentation. How do you see the emerging of Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement to tackle Indonesia's challenges towards food security? And furthermore, how do you think that Indonesia's government could maximize the agreement for this issue? Thank you.
Thanks, Gwindra. And the final question, I'll call on Hal. Please go ahead, Hal.
Thanks very much, Alison, and my congratulations to all the speakers for another really excellent day of the update. I've really enjoyed it. Pak Bud, selamat siang. And I wonder, Bud, if I could ask you a quick question. It's really thinking back to the sort of medium-term impacts of the crisis. We have this sort of framework in our head, sort of the Sudley law, from earlier days, that Sudley said he observed that often bad times make for good policies. Now, that was an analytical construct really for the Suharto era. I wonder how you think that might be working out in the current era. Of course, at the moment, everything is about the crisis and the short-term issues and mitigation. But I wonder, standing back a little, do you see any likelihood that the Sudley law might again be in operation in this sort of democratic era? Thank you. Sorry, it's a very broad and tough question, but I'd be interested in any thoughts you might have.
Boediono, do you want to start with the
Alison.
answering? Thank you. You're on mute, Pat. But Budi, you're on mute.
Okay. You hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can now, Pat. Thank you.
Hal, I just have to admit that I cannot answer your question. This is a really difficult question. I think it goes to the more political issues, which I I prefer not to say anything at the moment. Thank you.
Do we want to have Pak Acho or Pippa answer the first or second questions?
Okay, thank you, Alison. I'll take a question from Pak Guindra on the ISEPA. Well, I think there are potentials for Indonesia and Australia to work together in the form of, especially in the form of powerhouse or joint hub. So for example, what I have in mind, so Indonesia can serve as a food hub in the region with ingredients and technology from Australia. So think about Indomie, for example, whose wheat actually mainly come from Australia. An analogy for this is the Japanese automobile hub in Thailand. And another example would be for Indonesians to invest in cattle farm in Australia. So when it comes to importing the produce back to Indonesia, it won't have high resistance as it has traditionally. So and another analogy for this is the Malaysian partial ownerships in palm oil in Indonesia. So there are some room to work together. Thanks, Alison. So maybe Pippa can take the other question.
Thank you, Pak Acho. And I'll take another question from Riza, my fellow ANU alum. So to Mbak Riza, the fact is that we see that the current self-sufficiency policies and trade restrictions are also already not helping farmers. So just looking at the statistics, in the past 2 decades, we've actually lost 10 million farmers leaving the agriculture sector. And this is expected because the agriculture sector is just thought to be not profitable at all. And this is also reflecting on the fact that farmers are disproportionately poor. So current poverty rate among farmers are at 18%, which is double than the national poverty rate. And also, interestingly, part of the reason why farmers are still poor is they actually spend more in terms of their food consumption, more than the income that they receive from their food that they harvest. So in terms of the economic terms, we usually call them net consumers, that they spend more than what they receive. So currently the restrictionist policies are also not helping because, as I said, it's really not combined with any meaningful support system for policies, for the farmers, I mean. So instead, the policies that we think would support these local farmers, especially during the pandemic where they're seeing reduced income, are really support on providing greater access to capital, which I know a lot of farmers have been struggling with, especially now, and also improving access to extension and education services that are badly needed for farmers. And there are multiple other support systems that already exist but needs to be improved, like farmers insurance system and other knowledge transfer system, and also support system and supervision during on-farm activities, and also to have value-adding activities. So those are the kinds of support that would actually help farmers rather than the current protectionist policies. Thank you.
Thanks, Pippa. Did any of the other speakers want to add to any of those responses? Okay, we'll move on to the next set of questions then. So the first question will be from Jean-Luc Moret from the Graduate Institute in Geneva. The second question will be from Weni Lydia Sukma from BPS. And the third question will be from Ria Permanasari from the Ministry of Social Affairs. So I'd invite Jean-Luc to ask the first question. Please go ahead, Jean-Luc.
Can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everybody, and congratulations for a very good conference as usual. I'm sorry I'm not with you, but okay. The question is for Mas Chris. Hello, Mas. What do you think will happen with the omnibus law on labor, considering the present situation?
Thanks, Jean-Luc. And before we go on to the next questioner, there's a similar question from Asep Cahyana. He's a postgraduate student from UGM. So I'll just add that in before we go to the next two. There's two questions here, Chris. The first is regarding Kartu Prakerja. Many people say that online training is not in accordance with the learning character of Indonesians, so that it's not effective in improving workforce skills. What do you think? And the second one is the government has stated that it will continue to follow up on the work creation bill, RUU Cipta Kerja, which was designed before the pandemic with the hope of growing investment and absorbing more workers. What do you think about that? And now I'll invite Weni to ask a question. Please go ahead, Weni.
Hello.
We can hear you, Weni. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Weni from DPS. I want to ask to Chris Manning about the estimation for unemployment rate. Is it possible for the unemployment rate to increase until 7% in August 2020? Because the previous explanation from the Pak Acho and Ms. Felippa, there has been an increase in mobility in workplace and trading starting from May 2020. This means that many people have been carrying out work activities, including people who previously had jobless. And based on what I see now in my environment and in my house, there are many household business developing as early start of the pandemic, like selling the food and other services. Thank you. I hope the answer can satisfy. Thank you.
Thank you, Weni. And the final question from Ria. Please go ahead, Ria.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to ask to Vivi. You mentioned about the targeting system, and I would like to know.
We can't hear.
Yeah. Sorry.
Can't hear, Mbak.
Bisa sedikit lebih keras, Mbak.
Oh. Okay. Wait a sec. You already hear me?
Yes, that's better, Ria. Thank you.
Okay. So I would like to ask Ibu Vivi. You mentioned about the targeting system, and my question is, do you think targeting system is still relevant since it's very difficult to capture the poor, and it also needs lots of money? So what do you think? Whether is it better to have a comprehensive social protection with universal scheme? Okay.
Thank you, Ria. So there were quite a few questions there for Chris, so we might start with you, Chris.
Just need to restart.
We can hear you, Chris. Sorry, Chris, I'm not sure if you heard me though. I was just inviting you to kick off with the answers. We might have a bit of technical difficulties at Chris's end. So Ibu Vivi, maybe we'll start with you on the social protection question.
Okay. Yes, this is like the questions. Should we have a universal? Should we have a targeting? In this current situation, and especially a lot of like situation where budget is constrained, there is a need to make the best use of the budget. And the uncertainty of the pandemic means that the number, like the amount of that needed and like frequency of help may be more than just one time. Targeting is actually not expensive. Like Indonesia has done quite a number of like all over Indonesia doing a targeting system, doing a collection of the targeting system in 2011 and 2015. And like compared to the overall budgets of poverty, it's less than 1%. Like in terms of like the amounts needed to use for the improving of the targeting. And like a lot of the study shows that targeting, when it is done properly, when it is prepared properly, we can have quite a lot of good ability to address both the exclusion error and inclusion error. This is lessons learned from Indonesia, but also lessons learned from other countries. I think this is coming back to when we put like everyone, we help everyone, it means like with the budget constraint, we have a peanuts. But when we will be able to give to certain people who actually need it, then we can help more. But of course, that's why there is a need of like having this on-demand application system with verification, so that we can ensure that those who needs to have will have the ability to access. Everyone has the ability to access, but like it will be linked with a verified method to ensure that the constraint of budget is being used to help those who need help most.
Thanks, Ibu Vivi. Chris, do we have you back online? I think perhaps there's some technical difficulties in Jog today, so apologies to those 3 people who asked questions that were for Chris. Let's just see if any of the other speakers would like to respond. Pak Budi, for example. If not, we can go to the next round and come back to those ones. Okay, we might go to the third round. Oh, sorry.
Can you speak? I can answer those questions if you like.
Please do, please do.
Yeah, I desperately want to answer Jean-Luc Moret, who was my friend in Yogyakarta in 1974 when he was doing his PhD thesis. And his question was, about the omnibus law. I think it has a better chance of success than many of the other attempts to revise the labour laws of 2003, mainly because it's a package. And so there can be negotiation on different elements of the law, and the labour unions are more likely to give up some benefits in order to gain others. That's what I think, and really I think that's part of the Cipta Kerja component of that. The question asked by, was it by Widya? It also applies. That is, that's part of the package. So it's much more broader negotiation about labour benefits and employers' activities. So, but of course, that's very much a political process of which I don't have a great deal of knowledge. And the third question about online skills, online learning and skills. I'm not an education expert at all, but I don't feel that a priori what I think has been a very innovative approach to through the Kartu Prakerja. First time, I think, in Indonesia that sort of program that is demand-oriented, that is, students look for their own courses, and one that is online, very much going with the digital age. We talk all about it. We need to move in the digital age. Well, this was an attempt to do that. There were a number of problems, teething problems, but they were more to do with how the program was being managed rather than the nature of the program. So those would be my responses.
Thanks very much, Chris. I think we'll move on to the next round of questions. The first one will be from Terry Hull from the ANU. The second from Herni Ramlaningrum from Prakasa. And the third from Deviana Devi from SAIS John Hopkins. So can I ask Terry to go first?
Thank you very much. These are great presentations, and I really appreciate the perspectives of all the speakers. My question is for Chris and Vivi about the 2020 data collections, including the decennial census, which is supposed to be in the field right now. Do you have opinions about the potential impact of COVID-19 restrictions on the ability of BPS to collect high quality data? And do you believe that the data will very soon be publicly accessible? Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. And next we'll go with Hermie.
Hello, sorry, but can the moderator read the question for me?
Sure, no problem. I'll just have to find it again amongst all the questions. Just one moment. Here we go. This question is for Ibu Vivi. Since exclusion error is high, if we use targeting method, don't you think it's a momentum for Indonesia to try universal method? For example, providing universal basic income, especially because people need fast support and selecting the right target group is challenging, even though the potential of inclusion error in universality is also high. And then finally, the next question is from Ibu Deviana. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Alison. So I would like to ask question to Felippa and Chris, because I think these two presentations are also related in terms of food. So on one hand, we know that food seems to be a price or income inelastic product where the demand relatively remains stable. And on the other hand, it seems like agriculture sector is currently less affected by COVID than other sectors. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on opportunities and challenges to make agriculture sector more lucrative for job creation, so that we can probably help reduce unemployment and hence promoting more growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Deviana. We might go first to Pak Acho or Ibu Pipa. You might like to take that last question first.
Sure, Alison, thank you. And thank you, Bu Deviana Dewi, for the question. I'll try to answer and see if Pak Acho and Pak Chris may have any additional thoughts. I think we have been seeing a lot of people moving back to the agriculture sector, especially on a micro case. We see that happening in Bali as the tourism sector are most affected. So people have been returning back to agriculture. But unfortunately, I think on a broader level, the agriculture sector remains rather uninteresting for the younger generation. They still see it as a manual labor and also very unsure of the profit and the lucrative or the profit that can come from agriculture sector. But we have been seeing a lot of interest in modernizing the agriculture sector. So a lot of new tech startups in agriculture, a lot of younger student organization trying to have a movement back into agriculture, but we're still seeing that on a micro level. More generally, though, it still remains challenging to invite people back to agriculture. Perhaps Pak Acho and Pak Chris may have other thoughts as well.
Sure. Thanks, Ibu Deviana. I agree that at the moment, agriculture and manufacturing sectors are still the main contributors to the economic growth. And in this pandemic time, agriculture seems to be more resilient, especially in the production stage, but less so in distribution and delivery stages due to the logistic disruption. So I think policy needs to focus on this, helping the logistics and at the same time supporting agriculture sector to be more integrated with the manufacturing, for example, in the subsector of food and beverages.
Thanks, Pak Acho. Chris, if you'd like to give us your response to that question as well, and then continue on to the question about the census. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I can't really answer that question very well, but I'd like to offer a perspective, and that is that in 1998, when the Asian financial crisis occurred, agriculture was a savior and people were encouraged to go back to agriculture. With the COVID, people have been discouraged from moving out of the cities into rural areas for the fear of the spread of the virus in local communities. And so there's a very different approach to the utilisation of labour and agriculture this time around, apart from the issues of people not being that attracted to agriculture. So that's my perspective on that. And on Terry Hull's question, I'd love to be able to answer it, but I have no idea. Vivi, I think, will be much better placed to answer it. I just don't know what the effects are on the census overall.
Thanks, Chris. Over to you then, Vivi, to talk about the census and then that second question from Herni as well. Thanks.
Yes, Terry, it is a dilemma here. We do need data to understand better, but at the same time, during COVID and with this ability to get data at the right times we may have a slowing down in that. But I think on the census and other data, there is a need to combine the online and offline. Actually, today, BPS people came to my neighborhood, and because I've already replied through online, I was not asked for the census. I've already answered all my questions. But for some of the other, for my neighborhood, they did like from the outside di pagar on the gate and asking the questions through the gate, ensuring the protocol can be done properly. I think it is important overall, not only on census data, to understand the limitation of sometimes an online survey, the selection bias of a conducting survey. BPS already have like this the framework of the sampling that you can ensure that it is actually representative. But at the same time, they need to do like all kind of methods to ensure either like through phone, through WhatsApp, through others, to ensure that ability to have good satisfaction, not like high attrition rate. For other survey that we know that there are so many online surveys on COVID. The selection bias is a big issue in here, and it's difficult for us to ensure that indeed the result that we see, is it commonly from like overall representative, or is it just because of like people who are more educated tends to be the one who answers? I think this is another issue in here. I tried to ask about like when the census will be available. I happen to have Norma, the head of the census, in my WhatsApp number, and she is in the middle of meeting and she said bentar. So I'm not quite sure, so I will be able to answer you when will it be available. I'll send you an email when she replied.
Thanks, Vivi. Do any of the other speakers want to contribute anything more from that round? No? Okay, we'll go on to the next round of questions then. The first question in this round is from YouTube, so I'll read it out. It's from Avi Mahaningtias. Are there scientific considerations to estimate climate and environmental costs that Indonesia needs to pay to ensure food security and crisis recovery post-COVID-19? And then the next three questions will come from Pak Khatib Basri, Rita Simorangkir, and Sisira Jayasuriya. So Pak Dede, I'll ask you to speak first.
Thank you, Alison. My question is for Acho and Felippa. One thing that's been missing in the discussion, not only in this update, is about the international cooperation, because every country are focusing on their own problem. So my question to you, Pa Acho, I was wondering, one of the important issue is about the flow of the medical and food. but every country now is focusing for their own domestic needs. Do you have any idea, is there any sort of like quick wins that can be done on related to this issue? The second one, after the COVID, one thing that we need to push further is the mobility of people. Yeah, but the problem is everyone need to conduct a test. What do you think about the traveling certificate? So if you conducted the PCR test in Australia, will be accepted in Indonesia and you don't need to do it. A sort of like a quick wins can, help the economic recovery.
Thanks, Pak Dede. And Ibu Rita, would you like to go next?
So my question is to Ibu Vivi. Thank you for an insightful presentation. To link the individual on-demand data with other data such as tax and BPJS is remarkable, but at the same time, to me, it's very terrifying, especially in a country like Indonesia where data protection level is relatively low. So I'm wondering what is Ibu Vivi's opinion regarding the risks of combining of this data and who should host this data to remain neutral and safe? Thanks.
Thanks, Ibu. And finally, Pak Sisira, please go ahead. Pak Sisira, are you still online?
Yes, I am. Yes, thank you. Yeah, my question is primarily to Chris, but perhaps also to others in the panel. The scenarios that have been presented in Chris's presentation, for example, of a V-shaped recovery and a U-shaped recovery, all seem to assume that the worst is over. Whereas if you look at what has been happening in India and perhaps also in Brazil and the US, the infection could get worse. It could spread further. Inshallah, it wouldn't in Indonesia, but it is not it's a possibility. And I wonder whether you have any sense of the likelihood of that happening, and if that were to happen, what would be the implications for labor markets and policy? Thank you.
Thanks, Pak. Chris, I might ask you to kick off with the answers to those questions. Silakan.
It's of course the question that everyone has on their mind. Is this going to stop or is it going to go on for some time? And the evidence from Indonesia suggests, I think, that that COVID is still spreading, that it's widespread within the community, and there will be points in which the government probably has to shut things down again. That's happened in Europe. It's happened in many places. In Indonesia, the government has not bitten the bullet, but one can envisage that may well happen. There is a huge problem. Everyone doesn't think there's a problem because it's not visible, but it's there, and the statistics suggest it's getting a little bit worse. So if I use the terms V and U-shaped recovery, I don't see Indonesia as yet in a U-shaped recovery from a labour market point of view, and I think it's going to be crisis mode, I think, for the next 6 months at least, in just providing jobs. The reform of the labour market and the longer term issues are something that can only be addressed in a period of time once the short term crisis issues have been dealt with. It's rather a negative response, but that's what I think.
Thanks, Chris. I might throw to Pak Acho and Bu Pipa on the first and second questions on climate and environment, and also on Pak Dede's question about international cooperation.
Thank you. I'll take Pak Dede's question first. It was pleasing to see this at the G20 meeting in late March or early April. The leaders agreed to be united in trying to avoid trade wars, closing the borders and things like that. But as we know, as it turns out, there's some countries still doing, closing the borders out of fear of limited domestic supply. So I think this needs to be supported more, but at the same time, there are needs for creative solutions that also involves private sectors. For example, when the first case appeared in Wuhan, of course, because of the restrictions, tourists are not coming to New Zealand. But then that worries New Zealand's government a lot, because the fresh produce from New Zealand cannot go back to Wuhan, to China with the same airplane. So what they did is to allow the private sectors to give some support and incentives for the airlines to go, even though they don't fly with passengers, human passengers, but the cabin, the underneath the cabin are full of produce, fresh produce from New Zealand, and that helps the market to still, especially the agriculture sector to still operate. So I think this kind of creative solution needs to be identified and also supported when it comes to ensuring the flow of food. And also solution like traveling certificate, I think that's a good idea. So question from Mbak Afi on the climate change. I'm not aware of real coordination at the ASEAN level or other regional level at the moment, but I think there is an ongoing studies and research group on this issue. For example, in IFPRI organization, they have some group looking at the COVID-19 and climate change, and I don't know the details yet, but I'm sure there are some initiatives that look into that aspect as well. So maybe people can also add.
Thank you, Pak Acho. Yes, I also do not have the data ready in terms of the climate and environmental costs of that. But I remember about the food estate especially, this is just lesson learned from previous similar projects. For example, the Mega Rice project that caused fire in the peatland that was developed for that Mega Rice project and releasing large volume of carbon emission, which is a significant climate and environmental cost that we would preferably avoid this time around. And then another thing, jumping on Pak Acho's point about initiatives, there are also already initiatives for sustainable rice production and also good agriculture practices in Indonesia. This is just to respond to, we all know that agriculture is also a significant contributor to climate change. So it's good to see there are existing initiatives with local farmers already in place in Indonesia to address that.
Thanks, Pippa. And I think I'll throw to Ibu Vivi now for the question on data and poverty. Please, Ibu Vivi.
Yep. On Rita question, yes, indeed, confidentiality is very important here, and especially if like on the tax record, etc. I think there are ways to still get some ability to get a sense where they are in the whole distributions, but at the same time, like managing the confidentiality. For example, on the PBB tax, the land dwelling tax or other tax, you could have not really the particular household like tax record, but actually more the average tax NJOP in their neighborhood, the standard deviation, to get a sense of where they are, where they come from. And you could also have, instead of like the amount, but it's more an indicator of like whether like, so the tax office may, this is of course subjects of like legality, the tax office may provide input regarding information regarding where they are. Is it the highest deciles or is it the lowest deciles, etc. Not really giving the particular amount of money, how much certain individual paid on taxes, for example. And I think the non-controversial one, the utilization of electricity and even more utilization of phone bill, like a better, like it's a very good way to really get a sense of like the proxies of like the welfare and indicators of those particular households. So on like overall, yes, it is possible, but we do need to be taking into account this confidentiality and try to find ways to still get information without breaching the confidentiality.
Thanks, Vivi. I think that answers all of the questions from that round. So we'll go on to the next one, and this will be the last round of questions. So the first one is from Kali Yuan from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. This question's for Pak Chris and Pak Boediono. If it was entirely up to you and political passage was guaranteed, what would be your top 3 labour reforms and why? For example, lifting limits on caps on foreign skilled labour, unemployment insurance and severance pay, or lifting limits on outsourcing at the enterprise level. Next, I will ask, there's a few that aren't live questions here that I'll ask on behalf of people, but do we have Linkan from Universitas Samratulangi online still? Linkan, are you there? No, okay. We'll go on to Khairul Azman from the Singapore Embassy, and this is another one that I need to read out. So let me just bear with me for a moment while I find it in my long list of questions. Okay, this one is for Pipa. What is your assessment on why the Indonesian government is maintaining import restrictions on food items, although it is clear that these restrictions have caused an increase in food prices? What are the factors that might motivate the government to shift its protectionist approach in the agriculture sector? Next question is from, let me see, Ibu Dia Pritad Rajati from the Asian Development Bank. Please go ahead with your question, Ibu Dia.
Thank you, Alison, for the opportunity, and thank you for the speakers for such a great presentation. So my question is directed to Chris. So yeah, we're all aware that the nature and source of the crisis in the case of COVID-19 is different, but how would we take our previous experience in the financial crisis 1997-1998 and the 2008-2019 as lesson learned in handling the current labor market problem, and particularly on how we make use of our previous data to look at the distribution of the impact. I mean, in the past, informal sector was considered as the quote-unquote savior, but probably it might be different in the case of COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibu Dia. And the final question is from Richard Borsuk, who is writing for Researching Southeast Asia in Singapore. This is a question for Pak Chris. How would the omnibus bill on job creation help labour? Draft has met a lot of resistance from unions who don't want the generous current severance rules eliminated. So those are the questions we have. And I think I'll go first to Pak Boediono for his views. Silakan, Pak.
Thank you, Alison. I think the question for me and Chris was about the labor reform or things that related to the reallocation of labor after the pandemic. My own priority, if I can say that, would be one, to help the matching of the supply and the demand of our labor post-pandemic. That needs a lot of things to do. On the supply side, you need a lot of work to get your labor ready for the new demand. This means, of course, a lot of training and the right training and the rest. On the demand side, I think you have to use the opportunities to boost the demand side and identify what kind of labor skills they need. And then we try to match that. And the role of the government is to do both on the supply side and on the demand side, and try to match them with whatever regulation or support. With regard to the more concrete things that were asked about, whether it was some kind of specific action, I would like to leave it to Chris, who certainly knows better than me about the labor situation in Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Chris, I think you've been thrown in it there. There's several questions for you. The top 3 labour reforms, the Omnibus Bill, and the lessons of 98. So we'll throw to you now. Silakan.
Yeah, that's a pretty tough ask, I must say. Unfair, really. But Boediono has the big picture answer. There's no doubt that there's an issue of demand and supply for skills, that people are in educational institutions that don't deliver the skills that are needed in the labour market. I suppose the only comment I'd make is post-COVID, I'm not sure what demand is going to look like. I think that's unfolding, and we probably are not going to be able to answer that, at least until we have the results of the National Labour Force Survey. We know what industries Indonesia is losing in, and what industries might, and not really at the end of the year, maybe what industries are going to come back, and how fast. So if we're going to pick tourism, then we need to know that the tourist industry is indeed going to come back fairly quickly. And that's not at all clear to me, given the international travel restrictions that are in place. Domestic tourism certainly can play an important role, but the international tourism may be quite different. In regard to the specifics, I think relaxation of some of the restrictions on foreign workers, which were part of the Omnibus Law, I think can make a big difference to productivity and help create jobs in Indonesia, because Indonesia doesn't always have the skills at the upper level needed for development. But I think that, together with severance pay and so on, should really be part of a bigger reform of labour and productivity. Bring them together, and that's why I like the idea of the Omnibus Law. I think that it's around the political issues. Severance pay has been a fight for 20 years. There's no point in going back and seeing if you can revise the severance pay law on its own. The workers will not accept it, as far as I can see, but maybe I'm wrong. So I think that probably answers most of the questions that I was trying.
Thank you, Chris. And we'll throw to Pippa now about the question from Kyril about the import restrictions. Pippa, please.
Thank you, Alison, and very good question, Kyril. I think there are several factors that makes import restrictions, that makes us Indonesians very anti-food import. Among those are nationalistic sentiments and also emotions and the political aspects of it. I think when talking to a lot of the higher echelons in the ministries, of course, they all look back to Bung Karno's original statement early in the days of Indonesia, where he said that food is the life and death of the country, and that kind of frames how we approach food security in Indonesia. And also just for the emotional aspects of it, when we're little, of course, all of us are taught to always love our farmers and always appreciate our Indonesian agriculture environment. I also would love to recommend Pak Jeff Nielsen's chapter on Feeding the Bangsa, which was published in the Indonesian Update book several years ago, which I think Pak Aco co-edited, that really does a really wonderful job of explaining and going through how this narrative came to be, and how the narrative remains the dominant discourse up until now. So I highly recommend that book. Thank you.
Thanks, Pippa. Pak Acho, did you have anything you wanted to add to the?
No, Alison, thanks.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think that brings our session to a close, only a few minutes over time. I'd like to really thank so much our 5 wonderful speakers today. It really was a fantastic and informative session, and we also had some wonderful questions from the audience too. So thank you everyone for your participation, and particular thanks to Pak Boediono, Acho, Pippa, Chris and Vivi. And please tune in tomorrow for the final session of this update, which is going to be on human capital, health and gender. Trouble behind, trouble ahead. So finally, thank you very much again, everyone. We hope you enjoyed today's session.
Thank you, Alison.
Thank you so much.
Stay safe, Bu.
Thank you, everybody.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Terima kasih banyak. A great
Thank you, Alison.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
While people are leaving, can I say hi to some friends?